Imagine a government you considered the guardian of democracy secretly intervenes in your mind. In the mid-20th century, the CIA conducted experiments with LSD and electroshock not in some distant laboratory, but on its own citizens, without their knowledge or consent. Some subjects died in agony, others lost their minds forever. Who allowed themselves to play with human consciousness for a higher purpose? How did agents manage to recruit doctors and justify abuses under the code names Project MK Ultra and Operation Mockingbird? And why, even today, do hundreds of files remain classified as secret, as if these crimes are still hidden from the world? In this video, step by step, we will unravel this web. From Cold War fears and the emergence of the CIA to shocking details about MK Ultra, the program that played a role in the tragedy of thousands of people. We will tell you about Mockingbird, where agents manipulated the press, changing the course of world history. And we will not overlook CIA operations in other parts of the world, those you have never heard of. Get ready to learn things that will shock you long after watching. Cruelty, deceit, and lies in the name of security. Let's begin. After the end of World War II, humanity sighed with relief. It seemed that the dark experience of prolonged bloody slaughter was finally behind. However, on the ruins of the former anti-Hitler coalition, a new confrontation began to emerge: the Cold War. There is no exaggeration in saying that the post-war world stood on the brink of nuclear apocalypse. The last minutes of the Hiroshima explosion had barely faded when suspicions and fears already engulfed the world. Would the Soviet Union prepare an even more terrifying bomb? Or could the British or French act independently? It was in this tense atmosphere that the U.S. Biden administration, more precisely by the Truman administration, made a decision that ultimately defined the face of future intelligence. In July 1947, the National Security Act was signed, creating the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, as well as establishing the positions of the National Security Council at the President and the National Intelligence Council. A little later, the NSA, National Security Agency, appeared, which handled cryptography and radio interception. Imagine, one war has just ended, and the government is already forming a new mechanism for controlling world events, deciding how to prevent the communist threat even before it arises. The State Department, which until recently dealt mostly with diplomacy, now had to coordinate with the newly created intelligence services. A clear division arose: official diplomacy at the level of ambassadors and consulates, and a shadowy one, aggressive, harsh, and ruthless. It was the CIA that took on the dirty work that even Congress was not supposed to know about. As soon as the CIA was created, several urgent tasks were set before it. The primary task was to collect and analyze information about the Soviet Union and the entire Eastern Bloc. By the fall of 1947, no service in the U.S. had such broad powers. Effectively, all active sources in Europe, Asia, and even South America had to align with the newly created intelligence network. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which had outlived its usefulness, was subordinated to the CIA, along with units working on counterintelligence in Western Europe. At the same time, the Soviet Union was officially designated as the main adversary. Already in 1948, American spies discovered that former Nazi scientists who had researched parapsychology and extrasensory abilities were actively being recruited in Moscow. Astonishing but true. Gestapo adherents who had experimented on people just a few years prior were ultimately working for the Kremlin. This information, combined with intelligence about the rapidly advancing Soviet nuclear program, sparked near hysteria in America. If the USSR mastered ideas like remote mind reading or mass hypnosis of the population, how could one counter a threat that was not limited to atomic bombs alone? At this moment, an internal fear arose within the CIA. It was no longer enough to simply collect photographs of airfields in Siberia or intercept radio signals from Kiev. The real battlefield had to become the human mind. The idea that one could discern an enemy's intentions through psychotropic substances or psychological stimuli quickly spread among several young agents who had previously served in the OSS. These agents reported, "If laboratories could create new medicines, why not create a mind weapon that changes consciousness without direct use of violence?" That is why, by the end of 1947, the CIA created the first units that later became known as the Special Operations Division and the Technical Services Staff. These employees were responsible for developing and implementing methods of psychological influence, experimental psychotechnologies, sensory isolation chambers, and work with the newest synthetic drugs. The most frightening part was that most of these operations were classified even from the highest CIA leadership, outside the scope of payrolls and congressional reports. Imagine the United Nations cabinet, where diplomats compete for peace, while far below in the dungeons of Fort Monroe or secret bunkers within university campuses, the CIA conducts experiments on volunteers and underage psychiatric patients. We are talking about dozens of laboratories, from a storage facility in White Sands, New Mexico, to isolated rooms on the campuses of Harvard and Cornell. Those who participated in the programs often had no idea of the true nature of the experiments. They were told it was research into the metaphysical abilities of the human brain, treatment for PTSD, or development of new army drugs. Instead, they received doses of LSD, barbiturates, and became subjects of sensory devices simulating vision deprivation or sound isolation for weeks. At the same time, massive media campaigns about the Soviet threat began. Newspapers and radio stations in the U.S. constantly quoted experts. Allegedly, Moscow had long been using psychotropic hooks against its citizens and prisoners of war. Thus, the USSR was often called an experimental laboratory for mind control. But there was no concrete evidence, only intelligence data, which in most cases was kept classified as secret. These rumors caused panic among the population. Are they trying to use us as test subjects? Americans asked each other in friendly conversations. Under this pressure, the administration prepared fundamental measures, expanding the agency's staff, increasing funding for psychophysiological research, and introducing neurophysiology specialists into the staffing roster. All this occurred between 1949 and 1953 when President Harry Truman and then Dwight Eisenhower faced difficult crises: the Korean War, the Berlin blockade, and the beginning of the nuclear arms race. At the official level, the government firmly emphasized, "We stand against the aggression of the Soviet bloc." But simultaneously, at a secret level, the concept of indirect war appeared. This term meant not always shooting physical bullets and bombs, but influencing the enemy's consciousness through media, propaganda, and in extreme cases, through biochemical means. Worse still, in the search for new psychological warfare methods, the CIA quickly turned into a black market of ideas. For some experiments, they hired the best neurosurgeons from German departments who had arrived in the U.S. just a few years earlier thanks to Operation Paperclip, an operation to transfer Nazi specialists. The same doctors who once conducted horrific Nazi experiments in concentration camps now became CIA consultants. Yes, the very people who, in 1944 at Auschwitz, selected prisoners for medical experiments were, by the late 1940s, working on creating methods of remote mind control. Experimenters were driven by the idea: if it were possible to force a person directly through psychotropic stimuli to disable their own will, recall secret data, or even harm themselves, it would provide a colossal advantage in the game conditionally called the Cold War. Some called it a victory without shots. One correct dose, and you destroyed the greatest enemy, so that no one would ever guess where the mad agent came from. Meanwhile, in Washington, there were increasing debates about whether they might be going too far. News of strange cases, patients disappeared after experiments, or volunteers took incredible doses of substances and turned into puppets, made some congressmen raise alarms. However, most of the minor details remained classified. The dossier of psychotropic operations had the classification Top Secret, No Foreign, for official use only, not for foreigners. All this unfolded against the backdrop of avalanche reports in the press about red threats, spies in hospitals, government secrets, double agents. The same events in the Soviet Union were covered exactly the opposite way. The CIA manipulated the Darkasov Institute to launch psychotropic weapons against the peoples of Eastern Europe. The tragic reality was that Americans and Soviet shadow operatives, as they were called in the crowd, together invested huge sums in research on underground weapons. Imagine someone quietly opening the door to a concrete corridor where the sound of your own heartbeat begins to ring like an alarm. You cannot see the source of light, only a faint reflection of a lamp slowly turning on cold whiteness. From the darkness emerges a figure in a white coat, and they are already near, and your hand is forced to reach out toward a needle filled with a transparent liquid. You do not know that you are about to become the subject of one of the greatest crimes against human consciousness, and no one warned you about the consequences. This is how, without mercy or explanation, the project called MK Ultra began. In mid-1953, the CIA planned an experiment that exceeded all bounds of humanity and common sense, personally led by Allen Dulles, a director who never doubted the necessity of sacrifices for the sake of national security. No one in Washington knew all the details because the names of the subjects did not appear on any lists. They were called counteragents or potential agents, as if a flesh-and-blood person was reduced to a coded concept. Officially, the project was registered in CIA archives under the highest secrecy classification. But behind closed doors, the mocking laughter of scientists and agency staff erased all moral warnings. The methods they pioneered were illegal, but secrecy decided everything. The primary goal of MK Ultra was to break the enemy's consciousness before they even realized what was happening to them. Imagine, an agent receives a cure, supposedly for depression or post-traumatic stress, as if wounded in the Korean War. In reality, this cure contained microdoses of LSD that gradually destroyed the nervous system and forced the person to reveal everything they knew, and then, when necessary, permanently erase the memory of their own actions. History remembers an episode when, already in 1953, the body of a young subject was released from the laboratory, officially recorded as death due to improper intake of psychoactive substance. In truth, the LSD in his regimen, combined with 3 days in complete sensory isolation, caused his heart to stop. His name was never declassified. Later, the most famous universities joined the work: Harvard, Cornell, Columbia Medical College. The scientific community discussed organizational problems and method packages from the front rows, but simultaneously pressured so that no one would ever learn the results of these studies. The first versions of psychotropic tests were conducted in underground rooms of military medical clinics, where patients were lured by videos titled "Your PTSD, Our Priority." In reality, this was only a cover for sending volunteers into deep hell, where electroshock was combined with drugs causing hallucinations. At the same time, in Canada, at the psychiatric clinic in Montreal, patients hospitalized for severe depression were subjected to new diagnostic procedures. It was said to be an innovative experiment using barbiturates and brain stimulation. In reality, the experiments resulted not only in temporary personality breakdowns, but also deaths in the night wards, when those who screamed in agony simply disappeared by morning. Official medical reports stated natural death or unexpected complications. But those who saw catheter marks and needle punctures understood the real cause well. The most diabolical mechanism was sensory deprivation. The subject was deprived of the ability to see or hear, isolated in a special chamber where there was no point of reference. No lamps, no sounds, not even a hint of texture underfoot. After a few hours, the person entered stupor. After a day, hallucinations. By the third day, the only real sensation was their own pulse. Combined with LSD or barbiturates, this turned into torture. Consciousness fragmented into elements. Pieces of humanity shattered like shards, and the subject was left with nothing but endless darkness inside. Now imagine the scene. Nighttime, a building where invisible locks are breaking, and amidst the sounds, only the forbidden melody of the radio station, Freedom of America, echoes. Down the corridor, a person is led who no longer knows who they are, only the number on their back. Subject 37. They are quietly forbidden to look at the guard's face. Instead, the authorities inject them with new drug number 128 to enhance auditory fragments. Within minutes, everything around begins to slowly dissolve, and the person gets lost in memory. Is it now, or was it just yesterday? A year after the project began, funding increased almost tenfold. If initially the CIA allocated $150,000 to understand at least the general mechanisms of programming, by the late 1950s, millions had already been poured into MK Ultra. This money went to creating special hangars where dream lenses were built, devices that created artificial images on the inner surface of the eyeball. Laboratories in small towns at railway junctions, Springfield, Buckingham, Sierra Leone, deployed production of electrodes inserted under the subject's skin, supposedly to measure the activity of the brain's striated body. In reality, these small microfilms allowed signals to be input into the brain, which simply destroyed the boundary between reality and imagination. Alongside Harvard offices, private clinics appeared where qualified doctors wrote in papers, "I performed prefrontal cortex stimulation on a victim with pronounced encephalopathy." In reality, iron mechanisms that squeeze the head were only needed to fix and hold consciousness while externally programming the desired result. Remember everything about Soviet spies. From now on, be my instrument. Sometimes programming was done several times a day. Then excessive doses of barbiturates were added. Thus, subjects simultaneously experienced hallucinations and electric shocks, and losing contact with reality turned into helpless puppets. There were also cases when patients were simply removed from the program, blindfolded, and taken to a secret desert dump. Brain tissue leaking through broken skull bones caused nausea even in soldiers who transported the bodies of counteragents in truck beds. The next day, the instructions read, "No report needed, identities not to be disclosed." In 1955, information about artificial consciousness beacons, which emitted signals from machines on wheels traveling along Highway 95, finally reached the ears of State Department leadership. The polite men in suits panicked. Can we risk giving the enemy such a trump card in the form of controlled agents? But Dulles, as if indifferent, said, "This is our advantage. Let the enemies live in fear that we are reading their thoughts." Of course, as funding increased, so did the involvement of contractors. By the late 1950s, the MK Ultra list included over 80 institutions, from suburban psychiatric sanatoriums to military bases in Virginia and California. Some private doctors didn't even know whom they were dealing with. They signed contracts, received budget grants, and were guided by the order, "No unnecessary questions." The list also included prison facilities where experiments were conducted on inmates, promising sentence mitigation in exchange for positive behavior during therapy. In reality, the horrifying procedures slowly stripped them of their freedom and any basis for returning to normal life. By 1956, MK Ultra had turned into a giant machine, sweeping away moral prohibitions. If initially only a few dozen subjects were in the program, soon their number reached thousands. Who were they? Some were veterans who fought in Korea, suffering from hidden PTSD. Others were homeless people collected from subway stations in Boston. Others were psychiatric clinic patients whose family history of depression and epilepsy served as justification for their inclusion in the U.S. leadership program. Most of their names were lost in the thickets of secret folders. It took just over 5 years before the first internal report appeared stating no benefit from such experiments. Many subjects suffered memory loss, personality damage, the disappearance of the self. But it was already too late. Documents showed that the CIA knew they were creating adapted sick people on whom any information could be stuck without remorse or simply extracted from their minds. In the end, MKUltra became a dark stain in U.S. history, along with dozens of unknown deaths and thousands of broken lives. A project that was supposed to be the engine of revolution in intelligence was most often perceived as a machine of fear that consumed too much blood and tears. And even when some files were declassified in 1977-1978, so many ink blots remained that no one ever learned the full truth. And when you wake up tomorrow and read news about yet another secret intelligence program, remember, MKUltra is only the first chapter of a long nightmare that led to countless tragedies, and our time may not be as safe as many think. Soon we will tell you how the CIA manipulated the media under Operation Mockingbird, but the previous wounds still ache. Imagine a military base where bottles of clear liquids lie on tables, and several lab rats thrash in cages, nearly bursting from hallucinations. A few walls away are tiny rooms where Subject X sits alone with a hood over his head, hearing nothing but his own rapid heartbeat. This X is actually Franklin Olson, a biologist from the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, who in November 1953 was forced to drink a few drops of LSD under the pretense of a phrenological study. He found himself in a cauldron of panic, seeing lab rats destroying each other before the eyes of the experimenters. His consciousness shattered into pieces. A week later, Frank Olson fell from the window of his New York hotel room, officially recorded as a suicide, but no one doubted. The CIA knew what it was doing with people who became too dangerous witnesses. Meanwhile, the LSD unit within MKUltra was working at full capacity. Since 1953, 8 leading medical institutions joined the programs, from Harvard Psychiatric Clinic to Cornell University. There, volunteers, mostly prisoners or psychiatric hospital patients, received their first dose of psychedelics under the guise of treatment for schizophrenia or treatment for alcoholism. Some of those who consented began to float in dangerous visions within an hour, fearing their gut bacteria had turned into misanthropes, or hearing voices ordering them to give information or the world will explode. In such cases, the experimenter in a silent coat simply read notes and rejoiced. The reaction of Subject X was real material for further reports. In 1954, scientists from McGill University built the first sensory deprivation tanks under the CIA's aegis. They were constructed on the outskirts of Montreal and Boston, like secret facilities for political prisoners. There was nothing in the chamber. No baseboards, no sounds, no trace of light. From the first hour, the condemned began to feel like puppets in a labyrinth of their own fears. When LSD was added, within 2 days the subject's heart rhythm became irregular. Several cases of lethal incidents were registered due to acute tachycardia and respiratory arrest. One of them, Subject Y, pseudonym John Smith, died in February 1955 in a laboratory on the outskirts of Franklintown, Kentucky. The body was taken late at night, recorded as heart attack from unknown causes. Only many years later was it discovered. Death occurred after a combination of 250 micrograms of LSD and 60 hours in the tank. No less horror was caused by electroshock therapy. If in standard U.S. clinics in the early 1950s, patient discomfort was not to exceed 100 volts, in secret MKUltra units, up to 450 volts were applied through electrodes to destroy unwanted memories and deconstruct personality. In 1955, at a military hospital near Washington, At least 6 volunteers suffered severe brain damage. They lost the ability to speak and control limb movements. One of them, Korean War veteran George Clifford, after a session, became a silent, vacant stare. His mind was burned out by discharges exceeding allowable norms. The consequences of these experiments were not long in coming. By the end of 1957, more than 20 people complained of depression, previously non-existent in their history. Among veterans who agreed to be volunteers in clinics, a wave of suicidal ideas spread. Between 1958 and 1962, at least 5 former MK Ultra participants took their own lives, unable to withstand the internal pressure of memories of endless darkness and electroshock. Despite initial CIA assurances that psychotropic experiments had a medical nature, in April 1963, the Senate heard its first loud mention. In the so-called Interim Report on Human Experimentation, Senate Select Committee, it was openly stated for the first time that a government agency researched methods of forced consciousness alteration without subjects' knowledge. Senate Ethics Advisor Dr. William Connors emphasized, "If the authorities can break the minds of subjects in underground laboratories, who will protect citizens from tyranny?" In June 1968, the New York Times published an extensive article titled CIA Mind Control Experiments, From Lab Rats to Volunteers. Journalist Margaret Fontaine described shocking stories of Subject X, the death of John Smith in the tank, and the helplessness of those who lost memory or face due to constant hallucinations. This publication caused a real information explosion. People called editors, shared rumors about relatives who disappeared in the 1950s, and demanded official explanations. However, only a vague response was given. MK Ultra was terminated and all data transferred to the CIA, marked top secret. There remained black holes in the documents. Some were deliberately destroyed in 1972 to protect national security. Only a few hundred pages were recovered, each containing such horrifying stories about mind torture that it was hard to believe the reality of what was happening behind closed doors. There was no escape from this pain. Surviving patients spoke of lifelong nightmares. Some saw themselves cut into triangles of light. Others heard voices whispering, "You are no longer human." In rehabilitation clinics, George Clifford woke daily feeling that his consciousness had been forcibly collected and rebooted with an unknown code. The realization that he was tortured not just by doctors, but by a state machine was the last straw for many. In this sea of suffering, the seed of distrust toward their own government was sown. The road to truth was difficult. Initial official hearings and internal investigations were frightened by grant leaks, and the true scale of MK Ultra remained recorded only in those ink blots later extracted from secret archives. But even after the 1968 New York Times publication, most Americans still believed such things existed only in terrifying legends. Now imagine you are an ordinary person in 1965 reading a report about a leak of information on LSD and isolation tanks, and simultaneously learning that someone in your family might have become a volunteer without their knowledge. Your heart begins to beat so loudly that surrounding sounds disappear, and an imaginary voice whispers, "You too could end up in this experiment." This is how a wide wave of fear was born, later provoking the first protests of civil activists and requests from victims' families. And even when Congress plunged into investigations, there were no real punishments. The most important documents disappeared without a trace, and the subjects X were never heard. Yet in that same 1968, as you read news about MK Ultra, your imagination involuntarily paints today's picture. Underground laboratories, yellowed over time records about deadly dosages, but among them still exists something alive. The memory of how easily the mind can be subdued if a criminal gets the right chemical tools and a hefty, secret budget in hand. This was only the beginning of the end of trust between the individual and the state, a fracture that would widen with time and hardship. The next chapter of our story will reveal how Operation Mockingbird transformed the media into sprawling factories of deception. Machines not of war for bodies, but relentless weapons for the minds of millions. Imagine waking up one morning in 1955, switching on the radio, or flipping through the pages of a newspaper, only to discover that instead of truth, you are fed carefully crafted narratives, orchestrated voices of announcers, and printed words of editors, all conveying a version of events dictated by unseen powers operating deep within the corridors of Washington. Operation Mockingbird began in silence, confined to a handful of shadowy CIA offices, where fewer than 5 embedded agents were tasked with infiltrating the major media corporations of the time: Associated Press, CBS, NBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and a myriad of regional outlets. These agents were recruited under the guise of national service, promised career advancement and immunity from ethical scrutiny. By the mid-1950s, the Mockingbird program evolved into an internal propaganda machine of immense scale and influence. Initially, only a select few journalists were handed coded instructions to write articles as if under the guidance of CIA leadership. But this list expanded rapidly. Between 1956 and 1957, the program grew to include approximately 60 employees of varying ranks, ranging from beat reporters and investigative journalists to photographers and radio show hosts. Each participant was tracked in a secret dossier labeled Tilt Shift, detailing which topics were permissible to cover and which were strictly forbidden. The tone and substance of every report were meticulously controlled through a network known as the Fund of Feelings, a covert mechanism designed to funnel government funds to journalists disguised as charitable grants aimed at supporting independent media. Every recipient was required to report on their useful contacts within editorial offices, creating an intricate web of influence and obligation. One of the most notorious agents, codenamed Alpha, operated within the Washington Post. He received clandestine monthly payments to a bank account under the false name Michael S. Bradley, all while publishing fierce articles warning of the Russian threat, denouncing Kremlin propaganda, and fueling public panic over the Korean War. Between 1950 and 1953, during the height of the Korean War, media outlets received direct text corrections from the CIA's central office. News was carefully shaped to depict Pyongyang as a ruthless aggressor, while South Korea was portrayed as the shining champion of democracy. Any material exposing systemic corruption in Seoul or revealing the horrific conditions within North Korean concentration camps was ruthlessly edited or suppressed, erasing criticism of Allied forces and amplifying the narrative that the light of democracy in Asia stands threatened with extinction. Journalists who resisted these imposed revisions suddenly found themselves branded as unreliable, losing not only access to Pentagon press briefings, but also their jobs and careers. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the Mockingbird network was more focused than ever on one goal: to sow fear among Americans. An agent with the pseudonym Bravo, working alongside the Miami Herald editorial team, daily printed trustworthy insights about a planned transfer of Soviet nuclear bombs to the heart of Florida, even though, in reality, enemy missiles were only awaiting activation orders near Havana. More than 1,000 publications hinted that Soviet ships might land on the coast, sparking panic cues at gas stations where people hoarded water and canned goods, expecting the end of the world. These materials were gathered and prepared under direct orders from CIA Director John McCone, who saw these sensational headlines as a real weapon to destroy public calm before physical blows could be dealt. But Mockingbird extended beyond the United States. Secret grants were sent to Europe, particularly Italy and France, under the guise of cultural exchanges. In Italy's capital, journalists from several national publications regularly received recommendations on how to evaluate political forces, especially those sympathetic to socialists or communists. One editor of Corriere della Sera even ran an anonymous column which included fabricated quotes from Soviet spies allegedly obsessed with Italian resistance to fundamentalism. Similar narratives were spread in French magazines that formed part of the CIA's support pool. Latin America was no stranger to Mockingbird's careful attention. During Chile's 1964 election campaign, the CIA invested tens of thousands of dollars in fictitious newspapers and magazines to sow distrust toward left-wing candidates. From a card with the code name Operación Tratativa, official money transfers were sent to several Chilean editorial offices, which under these funds were tasked with portraying the rhetoric of banning the Popular Unity Coalition. The result was a large-scale anti-communist campaign during the pre-election period, and Jorge Allende's victory in 1970 was seen in the U.S. as a terrible surprise, although in reality Mockingbird had tried to prevent his rise on the political horizon. Secret contracts and grant reports contained instructions: do not disclose funding sources. Do not abuse complex theses to avoid dragging the editorial office into investigations. However, when ties between media and the CIA began to be widely exposed in the late 1960s, several well-known journalists came under fire. One of them, Edward Meyer from CBS News, was removed from his position as insufficiently loyal due to his refusal to suppress a report on corruption in Vietnam. Another, John Griffin from the New Republic, published information about secret CIA missions in Cambodia, despite arrests and threats that such publications undermine national security. In 1975, the Senate created the Church Committee, a committee headed by Senator Frank Church, tasked with uncovering the full scale of the Mockingbird program. After 8 months of high-profile hearings involving journalists and editors, the first truthful testimonies emerged. The media truly served as a CIA tool to instill fear and manipulate public opinion. Names of agents working under code names were revealed, and internal telegrams were published, clearly indicating which materials had to be corrected in the interests of the state. Senator Church did not hold back his emotions. This is not just espionage, it is a betrayal of public trust. When the press becomes a weapon, we lose the very essence of democracy. Gradually but steadily, the scale of Mockingbird came to light. On the morning of August 2, 1975, the Washington Post published excerpts from CIA telegrams proving that most news about international crises was planned and released at moments convenient to leadership. The shock was profound. Americans began to realize they consumed fabricated sensation daily, built on fact substitutions. Despite loud revelations, no high-ranking officials were prosecuted. Original documents were destroyed or reclassified as secret again, and most journalist agents quietly returned to less visible positions. The consequences, however, were irreversible. Public trust in the media collapsed, as if the supports beneath a bridge had crumbled. People began asking, "Are we still being manipulated?" Today, when anyone can verify the news independently, we can only guess how much neutrality remains in the press, and how many phantom alphas and bravos still linger as unknown voices within editorial offices. Operation Mockingbird remains a warning. Those who control the media's polygraph can steer the thoughts of entire nations, never relinquishing their control over the levers of power. The Cold War was not simply a battle between nuclear arsenals and shadowy spies, but a complex web of secret operations spanning the globe, from the booming megacities of Asia to the remote mountain villages of Afghanistan. In the 1950s, as American intelligence sought to contain the spread of communism in Asia, it launched an operation codenamed Bluebird. This secret initiative in South Vietnam aimed not only to gather information, but to sow discord among partisan movements. Using clandestine radio stations, the CIA broadcast carefully crafted messages, disinformation that ignited hostility within local factions, fostered suspicion, and paralyzed resistance efforts. Under the guise of fighting for democracy, anti-communist organizations were funded, which did not hesitate to exercise brutality. Hundreds of villagers and even children became victims of savage reprisals over suspected disloyalty. Training sessions run by American instructors taught guerrillas sabotage and terror methods, effectively turning them into instruments of foreign geopolitics, where personal will was devalued. Meanwhile, in South America, a darker, more sinister story unfolded. During the 1960s and 70s, the CIA not only supported but effectively orchestrated coups that changed the fate of entire countries. One of the most horrific operations, Condor, was a coordinated network among military dictatorships in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Paraguay. Under this bloody codename hid systematic kidnappings of regime opponents, their torture and elimination. The CIA provided financial, intelligence, and technical support to these repressive regimes. It is known that American intelligence agents participated in preparing secret squads such as Chile's DINAMER, a unit responsible for neutralizing anyone daring to express dissent. The 1973 Chilean coup that brought Pinochet to power was not a mere accident, but the result of a carefully planned campaign where the CIA shared fear and manipulation techniques with local forces. Far to the east, away from America's southern shores, another massive operation was underway. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, as the Soviet Union strengthened its position in Afghanistan, the CIA launched a large-scale campaign to fund and train mujahideen, partisan units fighting the Soviet army. Beyond supplying weapons, including the famous portable Stinger missile systems, American agents organized broadcasts through Radio Free Afghanistan, a radio station aiming to bolster resistance morale among the local population. This was not only a military, but also an informational war. Alongside firearms, words, images, and songs were employed, stirring hatred and fueling resistance against Soviet invaders. The echoes of this operation are still felt today, as some former freedom fighters have transformed into new threatening players in the region. CIA did not overlook Western Europe. In the 1970s, a scandal erupted in France around the so-called City Group, an organization that, according to testimony, secretly financed far-right groups aiming to undermine leftist movements and maintain American influence in the region. The 1979 Moynihan Report sharply criticized these methods, emphasizing that CIA censorship and political manipulation in Western Europe threatened freedom of speech and democracy. All these operations, Bluebird, Condor, the Afghan campaign, and subversive activities in Europe, demonstrate that behind the facade of fighting for freedom and democracy lurked another war. A shadow war where the stakes were human lives, national independence, and trust in governments. The CIA operated beyond any laws and norms, shaping a world where ideology trumped morality and cruelty prevailed over compassion. Looking back now, it is hard not to feel a chill at the scale of these operations. They left bitter consequences for millions, from the burning forests of Vietnam to broken souls in Buenos Aires and shadowed mountains of Afghanistan. The world map became an arena where the U.S., through secret services, played geopolitical chess with pieces made of blood and fear. And this is only one side of the coin, as the darkest chapters of CIA history are still ahead. Already in the 1980s, when personal computers were just beginning to conquer the world, the CIA and other intelligence agencies realized the future of espionage lay in the digital space. In 1986, the Microcomputer Special Studies Program, MSSP, launched, the first systemic project to research and collect data via early computer networks, including ARPANET, the prototype of the future Internet. MSSP was the first step toward creating a complex cyber-intelligence network targeting not only computers, but entire state infrastructures. Within this program, the first Trojans were developed, malicious software that silently penetrated enemy systems, collected secret information, and could even cause physical damage to electronic networks. After the September 11, 2001 attacks, the pace of cyber operations sharply increased. The Patriot Act opened the door to massive budget increases for the NSA and CIA. Now, they not only monitored, but gained the right to mass collect information about millions of citizens' private lives, using projects such as PRISM and XKeyscore. Although these were NSA programs, the CIA actively cooperated and participated, gaining access to huge data sets, collecting metadata, and intercepting digital communications worldwide. In 2013, the world was shaken by publications from former NSA contractor Edward Snowden, who revealed the scale of these secret programs. Thousands of documents that surfaced showed how the state effectively gained unlimited access to privacy without explaining its actions to the public. Clear parallels can be drawn between these modern cyber operations and what happened under MK Ultra. Then secret experiments on human consciousness. Now on the digital traces each of us leaves online. The history of MK Ultra leaves us with an important lesson. The state will always seek new technologies to control people and abuse them under the guise of national security. Today, we know about projects from 2020 to 2020 that explore neurointerfaces, artificial intelligence for brain stimulation, and bioelectronic systems that can directly influence brain activity. These developments, though officially aimed at peaceful or medical goals, carry the potential for control similar to what was applied decades ago in MK Ultra. Ultimately, modern cyber operations and biotechnologies have become a new front in the ongoing struggle between freedom and control. And while we look at our smartphone or computer screens, we must remember, the technologies opening new possibilities can also become tools of invisible influence and manipulation, which began back when LSD and sensory tanks first entered secret laboratories. This legacy leaves a deep mark on the modern world and forces each of us to ask, where is the line between protection and intrusion into our freedom? The story of the survivor subject, which chills the blood, begins with 10 years of silence. The person we will call Jeffrey spent most of his life in the shadow of his own memories, silently suffering from terrible hypnosis and psychotropic manipulations that broke his consciousness. Only many years later did he dare to tell the world what he endured in the hands of secret MK Ultra experimenters. His dossier is a collection of broken neurons, extracted memories, and irreversible brain damage that official medicine has never been able to explain. This testimony became one of the catalysts for the official U.S. Senate investigation in 1975, known as the Church Committee. The committee made great efforts to shed light on MK Ultra's activities. But even today, about 15% of files related to this program remain classified. These pages, like dark stains on history, still hide information that could illuminate the fates of hundreds of people and possibly reveal new, shocking details. Why are these materials still hidden? Perhaps the answer lies in fear. Fear that the truth would destroy the reputation of the state and change the perception of the past. Parallels with the history of Bergen-Belsen, where Nazi crime evidence was undeniable, from video footage to survivor testimonies, are just as clear here. MK Ultra has its own videos, witnesses, and documents that cannot be denied. But unlike open post-war trials, these files remain closed, and most victims have never received proper recognition or compensation. According to recent data, about 80% of subjects who went through the horrific experiments were never officially recognized as victims or received any form of state assistance. Their lives remain broken and their stories forgotten, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. This is the most shocking truth about MK Ultra, a program that took hundreds, if not thousands, of human lives, left behind countless unknown and still closed secrets, and tens of thousands of broken fates still waiting for justice. The story of MK Ultra and operations like Mockingbird shows us a brutal reality. Even the most democratic state can turn into a laboratory of horrors, where human consciousness becomes an experimental field, and truth a subject of manipulation. These stories remind us that public oversight, transparency, and accountability of intelligence agencies are not luxuries, but necessities for preserving freedom and humanity. Are we ready to trust official reports when hundreds of documents remain hidden under the secret stamp? What other secret projects might exist today, about which we have no idea? These are the questions to keep in mind when analyzing the information around us. In the next video, we will tell the story of Operation Chaos, one of the darkest and largest CIA programs to undermine foreign media. We will also delve into the details of the MK Naomi project, biological weapons of the Cold War era that frighten with their reality. Don't forget to ask questions in the comments, share this video, and subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about the hidden and dark sides of intelligence work. Only together can we shed light on what is often hidden in the shadows.